the rest of our.
So, sorry about that, Bill. I was waiting for you to take a breath to start the recording thing.
All right. Well, sometimes just saying, hey, take a breath, Bill, and just move
Yeah.
on. But Gene, you want to sort of walk through some of the other things that we've found?
Sure. So I didn't go through our whole style guide, but we do have a really cool resource for you. It'll be on another slide. So I don't want to list every single thing, but I know there are certain things that come up a lot. One of them is just, I see in different news stories, coronavirus capitalized versus lowercase, and we're doing it lowercase, just like other diseases like measles. So if you think of that, we're lowercasing and being consistent, and AP style also says that. So and then also, I mean, the first thing there that you're seeing is just to be very specific with your language. So and also, I think when we get into like the confirmed cases or the known cases, that's the most important information for your readers, not so much projections and all that kind of stuff. And I know that big numbers and, having Trump say we could get to 200,000 is, a big headline. But I think for local news, for the most part, we're really interested in, the stuff that we can't get elsewhere. So just sticking with your confirmed or known cases and clarifying for readers that that's what the numbers are. So just being clear about that.
Dean, can I ask you here on that? And by the way, I want to welcome Katie Waddington, who joined us as well from USA Today. For those of you, if you don't know Katie, that's your bad, and you should get to know her. So what about, there are these different trackers that are happening that aren't the CDC. Johns Hopkins University is keeping a global index of confirmed, their word, I think, is confirmed. And the University of Washington has a tracker going as well that measures a different element of this, but they're non-governmental sources, but they appear to be trusted sources by our own reporting. And so how do those factor into what's confirmed and what's known?
Well, I think one of the most important things we can do is cite our sources. And what we've been doing is we've been really focusing on just being consistent and using CDC. I do know that some people are embedding, like you said, the Johns Hopkins map, for example. As long as we're being clear on sources, I think that's the most important thing, and also not maybe switching around a lot. So if you're I think sticking with CDC is great. Also, Katie's another person who I think you get into the copy editing stuff too, right? So in your background, and you're doing a lot of fact checking now for us. So so please feel free to hop in, and this is for anybody to contribute. So, but I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, Gene, let me just add really quickly on the Johns Hopkins. I think USA Today has been really good about linking to the data that exists there. And if you're looking at this from a global perspective, Johns Hopkins makes a lot of sense because they are identifying those known or confirmed cases. But we've also seen news reports in recent days that have questioned whether every country is providing the same level of insight on the number of known and or confirmed cases. And so that's why, particularly for a lot of our local properties, CDC at least provides a level of known or confirmed cases so far within that market.
Could I propose another scenario just for the consideration of this group? We've long had a standard of trusting government as a unimpeachable word. If a prosecutor charges somebody, that's different from their next door neighbor accusing them of something. Or if the police say that X number of crimes have happened, we take that on face value. And yet, in this case, I mean, China, I think, is an example of a government that's been accused of politicizing the numbers and manipulating the numbers for their own political expediency. And that may well become an issue in this country as well. So under what conditions would we consider whether CDC numbers that are part of a political organization ultimately still are the law or our definition of a fact?
That's a really hard question, Mackenzie. But I think what it gets to is, who do we trust? You know, so do we trust the government? Do we trust CDC over politicians who might be saying something different? Which, I mean, I don't know that they've always been aligned. I think CDC has taken some flack from the government. And so I think that what we want to do is trust the science more than anything else, right? So find the sources that lead us to the science.
Yeah, that's a really good insight, Mackenzie. And the reality is, this is all couched in the fact that you have to be tested to become part of a case. And we know that there's been flaws in the testing process. And I think anytime, particularly if you're a local journalist or you're sort of defining what's happening in your county or city, it is always good to make sure that we're providing that context of where the information is coming from, and it's based upon what we know of at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. Thanks for letting me interrupt. And while we are interrupting, a couple other people, Martina Stewart from USA Today has joined, although we can't see her, but we know she's there. And, hi, Martina, I see you just took your mic off.
Hi, I'm here. I just don't like video. It's nothing personal.
Okay, well, we don't give you a hard time about that, but we're glad you're here. And Bill, could you just back up a second, because Martina joined and Katie joined after you had given us some really useful background and context about important moments where we've had a new dominant news story that's caused us to have to come to grips with a new common vocabulary. So you had given the Magic Johnson example with HIV positive and a couple other things. Would you mind just going back real quick to make a few of those remarks for those who weren't here?
Yeah, and I'm happy to. And Martina and those of y'all from USA Today, thanks for joining. I have to say that as I've looked at coverage over the last few weeks, I've just been admiring the continuity that I've seen from USA Today, because the content there really sort of addresses and allows a lot of our local markets to focus on what's happening. But what's evolved out of the coronavirus is an example of a story that it forces journalists to be both adaptive and understanding that we're building a new level of understanding and uncertainty that's arisen from what's happening, because terms like shelter in place and safe distancing are terms that we wouldn't have even used more than a month and a half ago. And I cited, the example back in, I believe it was in the 1990s when Magic Johnson announced, and sort of the challenge that it came for newsrooms immediately to understand the distinction between HIV and AIDS, everything, because the context of writing headlines and becoming instant experts on this. We've seen this during 9/11. We've seen this during the Gulf War, about stories that have developed at such a time that we have to build some level of understanding. And I think the message that delivers early on is, be sure that we're providing context for our readers and don't assume that they understand what an acronym means or even what the CDC stands, because sometimes early on you've got to be able to identify that, and then through the course of time provide sort of the level of links so that people who aren't always aware of what's going on can at least refresh their memory of what these key terms mean.
Okay, thank you for that review. Gene, you were, I was going to say doing a great job as our cruise ship director, but it's toxic to be on a cruise ship. So as our host, where would you like to go next here?
Well, I think that we can continue along with these style reminders. I think we've talked about the confirmed versus known and known. Either one is fine, but just being specific with our language, and the fact that coronavirus is just lowercase for all of us, the people out there who care about copy editing. And then the other thing that I think is important is just kind of idea of avoiding calling this the Chinese flu and the Wuhan flu. And I've linked there to guidance from the AAJA, and we will share this deck out, right, Mackenzie, so that people can get a hold of the links.
Yep, sure.
Cool.
Yeah, in fact, maybe I'll put it in the little chat here in a second. Can I just share a little tale that I heard yesterday? A friend of mine is, I think her heritage is Vietnamese. And she told me, she's in Florida, and she told me that yesterday she finally had to decide whether it was safe for her to go outside or not because of the coronavirus, but because of the harassment and retribution and possibly violent reprisals that she would face as a person with Asian lineage. And I mean, I intellectually knew that, but just hearing her say that was heartbreaking. And all the more reason why the words that are on the screen are just like, we can't allow it. And so one question I have for Bill, and Bill, you're a member of AAJA. You might have some personal reflections on this yourself, but these are politicized words. And so when the head of state uses these words, we have a responsibility, or what is our responsibility to report about that and the cudgel that he's using them there for, without perpetuating the biases and the possible exposure that a friend like mine would have?
Yeah, that's a really good question on so many levels, and a personal question too. When news of the virus first hit, back when we were still able to go to our offices, there's a wonderful span of shops, Asian restaurants near where I work here in Austin. And immediately I saw the drop in traffic. I mean, usually lunch is bustling there. And I asked the owner, I said, "Are you going to be okay?" And he just shook his head, because immediately there was this sort of the public shaming and perception that existed, where he saw his business drop immediately, because we all have not all of us, but there's this tendency of generalizing the impact. And I do think that we have a responsibility when, regardless of whether it's the president or your neighbor, as journalists, let's identify this as a coronavirus. Yes, the roots came from a province in China, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to make that association immediately. I mean, the reality is the virus is the issue right now. Its locale has nothing to do with the wonderful people from that region, nor the wonderful people that live in your neighborhood. And I think we have to be sensitive to that. I saw a post on Facebook, and I don't know if it's true or not, but one of my friends in Oregon was talking about just the impact that people with Washington plates were having crossing into Oregon because of the breakout that had started in the United States in Washington. And, I hope we never get to a point of generalizing on that level.
Thank you. I know Oregonians typically reserve that level of vitriol for Oregon fans versus Oregon State fans, but that's all in good fun. Now this is getting real. Okay, thanks for going down that road. Jean, back to you.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that that the World Health Organization in I don't know, maybe I cannot remember, even though I just read it, which is just kind of, it was in 2015. So, forget about the 1900s. In 2015, discouraged the use of geographic locations when naming illnesses. I know that in the past, that was, often geography was incorporated into the name of a virus. But anyway, so we just stick with coronavirus and refuse to call it anything else, I think. So anyway, good reasons for doing that. So also, I think one of the things that has come up a lot is refraining from naming people who have tested positive or who have died. I think there are good exceptions and good reasons to have exceptions, but in my little town, we have sort of a monthly that comes out, not related to Gannett in any way. And I think they're naming every single person who's tested positive, which is just like, oh my goodness, not a really good idea. I think that our guidance is that these folks are like victims, and so we wouldn't necessarily be naming victims. So Bill, I think that you talked a little bit too about when we might have exceptions. Do you want to step in?
Yeah, I think, and we have someone from Salisbury on the phone call. An example recently where a 38-year-old person visited some of the bars and restaurants in nearby Ocean City, posted something on a Facebook video, and here's a case where our Salisbury newsroom did a really good job of, one, validating the information. I mean, the story itself came about because of the public awareness through this person's Facebook video, but they were good about not only validating the information from that person, but that person was also willing to talk on record about the impact. I mean, that's in the case where if the person knows that this is an on-record interview and there is a public reason to do it, I mean, they did the right things. They verified the information, they understood the public impact, and we had a source there that was willing to tell the story. That said, I think the CDC has also been really good about paying attention to sort of the public shaming and the perceptions that people have if they're considered presumptively positive or even self-quarantined. There's an inference that you're there for a reason. So we've just got to make sure that we are diligent in checking and making sure that anyone who wants to talk about this are also aware of how they become part of the public discussion and whether that's a scrutiny that they want.
I want to just pause and welcome Mavinti to the conversation. You might have been there the whole time. I'm just seeing that you're there, so welcome to you. And the rules of engagement here are basically feel free to engage at any time. So if you want to say something or ask something, that's how we're rolling here. I would like to know, Bill and Jean, on this issue of naming people, I want to split a few hairs just to understand it better. So we name a celebrity or a public figure. We had this story about the rock star that died last night. And so he's a public figure. And so he passes that test, but if there's some sort of shame associated with this, well, his family aren't public figures, and anybody who's nearby him, his friends, and aren't public figures, and yet by association, maybe they would come in for the same level of whatever the negative thing is that we're trying to avoid. So why, I know there are public figure exceptions for all sorts of things around privacy and libel and so forth, but why do we think that a public figure exception makes sense here when private figures are only a half a step away?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this to me is an example of really you have to look at it from a case by case basis. Here in Austin, where I'm based, the president of the University of Texas's wife tested positive. The Austin American-Statesman found that out because the president himself had indicated and shared that information. Well, that's a case where you've got a well-known public figure who, a credible source who shared that information publicly, but also did it in the context of, even though maybe his wife isn't as well known, still is very much part of the community leadership circles that exist in the community.
Mhm.
You know, since then, the Statesman has noted that, without necessarily naming names, that members of the president's family uh, had tested positive. So I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis about the impact, the reach, and so forth. In Pueblo, Colorado, heard from the editor, Steve Henson, who a public defender had tested positive. They didn't name the public defender, but did note that a public defender had tested positive. And then in the circle of the Pueblo community, that information then was circulated to those who were most directly affected, without anyone drawing conclusions about how he got it, or whether he had, uh, stayed within the realm. Because I think people sometimes go off the ladder in terms of saying, how did this happen? Did he not follow the same rules as everyone else? And as we know, this virus operates on its own level.
Got it. And I hope I don't appear to be badgering if I split one more hair here again to understand it a little bit better. My sense is that when we go out of our way not to name people for things, typically it's either because of a privacy reason, or it's has to do with some sort of cultural taboo. Now, that cultural taboo may in time become not a taboo, or less discriminated against thing. And so I'm thinking about HIV and AIDS in that way, or people being publicly identified as LGBTQIA, or things like that, which would have been handled differently 2 or 5 or 10 years ago as to what they are today. So what's the reason fundamentally why we're reticent to name people who have tested positive for this illness?
Yeah, I think there's 2 parts to that answer. I mean, I don't think anyone who has tested positive or presumptively positive, it's not the same as speeding 150 miles per hour down Main Street during rush hour.
Right.
It's not a crime from that perspective. It happened, and their case may be unique from that perspective. I mean, those who have shared their story have shared their story. And as journalists, we should always, on a case-by-case basis, decide, why they want to share that story from that perspective. But there's also this level of, because there's so many unknowns, that I do think we have to be sensitive. A quick example, I attended the NICAR conference in New Orleans. 2 people tested presumptively positive. I was more than comfortable sheltering during those 2 weeks. But even among my relatives and my wife's relatives, we had to be very careful, because they assumed, well, your husband is Japanese American, and he attended a conference where someone potentially tested, so he must also have the coronavirus.
Mm.
Not the case. But when you have to go through that level of explanation because people jump to assumptions, I think as journalists, we need to be cautious to make sure that we're not creating inferences or unintended consequences along the way. 5 years from now, maybe this may be a completely different discussion, but not everyone is even willing to share that they've got the sniffles because of that concern right now that it has unmitigated consequences.
Thank you for that explanation. What would have been a good opportunity for you to, with the relatives, to say, if we're going to speak in generalizations, then let's talk about how Japan and China are probably as different as Venus and Mars are from one another. So, that there's something else to that. Jean, where should we go next?
Yeah, I was just going to say too that I think I've seen some videos of people talking about the fact that, and maybe it is more people who are Asian American who have borne the brunt of some, you know, some nasty comments and stuff like that, who have tested positive and had to somehow felt like they had to like prove that they weren't irresponsible in terms of their actions. Like, I had no idea that I was positive when I was out, you know, and because I mean, it can take a long time for it to manifest in our bodies. So, so I think there is kind of a strange, you know, a strange kind of feeling that you have to justify or something like that. And the thing is, we don't know where we might pick it up if we pick it up. And at some point, I think it's going to be probably pervasive enough that it's going to affect a lot of people we know and stuff like that. But I think early on, people were afraid of the fact that they may have appeared irresponsible if they didn't go home immediately and lock themselves in their homes. So that's kind of naming people. I wondered too, I don't know, Mackenzie, if we want to, we don't have a huge group here, but if we want to open up to questions, or has anybody come across this, and if you handled it, you know, how have you handled it in your own newsrooms? Does anybody want to share any stories or?
Well, Bill just shared one of Salisbury's many controversies with that one story. But some other things that we're kind of batting around with what to do with are naming businesses who have employees that are either being tested versus have tested positive already. And the other part of that is sort of unrelated to that, but as these obits come in and the family is naming that the cause of death as related to COVID, should we be just sort of compiling that or trying to get more information from the family to put it into context? Or, you know, I mean, that is a record of sort. What are your guys' thoughts?
Hey, Gene, I'm happy to jump in first. I think the business angle is a really interesting question right now. I mean, this morning I was in line at our wonderful grocery chain. Everyone was social distancing. A lot of folks were wearing face masks and gloves and so forth. And yet, you know, you're sitting there going, could this well-regarded business suddenly see their circumstances change if someone were to track and say that a case happened at their business? You know, the reality is we don't know where many of these cases where you can define that you caught the coronavirus at this business or where that employee was affected. I think we have to be very cautious of that. If the business itself indicates that this happened and it's from a credible source, not an employee who's walking out the door, then yeah, you know, I think we hold up the same level of standards of what's the impact? Why would we do this? You know, if it's a truly public business like a grocery store and the owner has declared it or the store manager, I think that's fair game as long as we verify that information. For those families who want to share this information, the same litmus test comes into play is, what's the impact? Do they understand the impact? Do they understand the consequences? Why do they want to tell this story? Because the other side of this is, you know, we've seen cases of public employees who have said they have tested positive, then found out later on they hadn't. Or you know, GoFundMe sites because there's an emotional aspect of this. We have to just make sure that we are doing the walk ourselves of saying, why is this different than any other story, in the sense of why they want to tell their story and what the impact is.
And I think it's a good point, and one that we like to repeat as far as doing the walk. And I know you had a second question too, but I just, one of the things that we have talked about a lot, I think, in Legacy Gatehouse is the ethics walk, the ethics walk. So basically what that is where you just grab a couple of people, which we can't literally do that now. So we'll just have to figuratively grab people and just have a conversation about something that's coming up that, you know, it's like, I don't know quite what to do with this. It's what we're doing right here, I think, is an example of an ethics walk. But you could just, you know, get somebody on the phone for, you know, just one or two people on the phone. It's always good to involve or to bring in people who have diverse opinions or some sort of diversity if you can. So in other words, if you just surround yourself with everybody who's just like you're not going to have a very rich conversation. So I think it's important for us to, no matter what's happening throughout this, to ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing? Are we providing the right amount of context? Are we asking questions and getting confirmation if people are saying that they are? You know, that they got something from this restaurant or from this grocery store or something like that. So I think all of that's really important, just to check ourselves throughout this process. I think initially and possibly still, people are going so fast to get as much information out to everybody as possible. And we know that people are hungry for it. So it's just a matter of taking that step back and taking a deep breath and having the ethics walk. So I think it's something that I just wanted to bring up. And Bill, did you want to tackle the second question, which I can't now remember?
Well, Jean, if you can't remember, then how do you expect me to remember?
I swear I had it for a while and now it's gone.
Most of what we've seen is, you know, like a chicken processing plant having to shut down for 3 days. So they had actually confirmed that for us, things like that. And that's, you know, it raises a lot of other questions with food safety and manufacturers being open and in such close proximity for their workers too.
Yeah, I would say that's a really good example of because the owner was proactive in identifying the closing and so forth. The best thing we can do is make sure that we follow through in those circumstances. There was a Tex-Mex restaurant here in Austin where one of the employees, a popular restaurant, had tested positive for hepatitis, and I mean, it devastated their business for 2 or 3 weeks. But the owners were also really good about being proactive and discussing how they had cleaned up and done a deep cleaning and had identified the employee and were the root cause of it. And you know, to me, that's an example where the local media first had pounded so much on it that of course you wouldn't go to that restaurant. But the follow through in terms of the responsible media and the owner itself, I mean, their parking lot is essentially went back to a normal business cycle until, of course, all of this happened.
So, okay. Anybody else have any like kind of style / ethics questions? Because we do have a couple of ideas to go over and some resources, but this is really your time too. Are you guys there? I'm like losing my internet too. Before we go to the links, Mackenzie, can we go back for a sec? There are just a couple of ideas. One of them is that I think our readers are seeing a lot, and we talked about this a little bit before, like just defining terms. There's just so much going on with this. So if you can create a glossary that you can just attach to stories so you don't have to bog down every story with many definitions and that sort of thing, that's just a kind of a cheat sheet. So the terms that come up over and over again, even if it is CDC or, you know, the WHO, WHO or something like that. And then also, I don't know, like lately everybody's talking about PPEs and I'm like, I should definitely know what PPE is, but you know, it's like, I don't know. It's just like, we need to just make sure our readers are all like, you know, we've got all this stuff now, but just make sure they're able to catch up. And so just the ones that you guys use the most, I think is just a good thing to do if you guys aren't doing that already. And then also, I was on a really good webinar yesterday that was put on by the PowerShift Summit, and it included people from a lot of diverse journalism organizations. And it just reminded me how much sometimes we kind of do our go-to sources, especially when we're in the midst of something like this big crisis, but just to reach out to diverse communities, because they, in some cases, there are kinds of communities that may be dealing with this differently. It could be very rich fodder for stories, and also just to make sure our sources are are diverse as well. And especially when you get into science and medicine and stuff like that, a lot of times sources tend to be white males, and we know that there are so many more people out there. I think JAWS, which is a group that's for women, has a whole list of sources for science. So that's a really good resource if you want to diversify your sources, especially kind of those big official sources. But looking around in your own neighborhoods, in your own communities, to make sure you're diversifying as well. So I think those were the only two things I wanted to do before we go to the list of resources. Okay, so this is really simple, and I think Mackenzie, you said that you might share this link.
Yeah, what I plan to do is I recorded this conversation, so it takes like an hour or something for the recording to show up. So when that does, I'll send a link to that plus this these resources that you've shared here to this group.
Okay, great. So I don't think I really have to go through everything here, but just to distinguish some of the kinds of information. First of all, just making sure that you're always using trusted sources, as we've talked about before. So just links to CDC and WHO. And then also, we have a resource that we've combined AP and Gannett style guidelines. So for those of you who are like, ooh, it's just bugging me that we're not consistent on this, check out that resource. There is a password for it, but the password is DSpace, which is, it's right in there. So you can do that. It should only ask you for it one time, and then you can kind of keep it up as a tab or something like that if you're interested in that. Yeah, so if you just type it in once. But it's kind of a nice little, it'll have like specifics to Gannett. For example, Gannett is saying CDC is acceptable on first reference, which is different from AP style, but you can kind of see, for people who are really into style, this is gonna you're gonna be super happy about this resource. So.
Laura, looking at you.
So, and some of this, obviously, we know now really well the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic, but man, when this all first started, people were still kind of confused about some of that. And so this is something that's still building and being updated. And obviously, if you guys have any updates to it, you can reach out to me, and I'll make sure it gets updated as well. So
I'm just looking for quarantine here because this was one of the ones, and I think it remains inconsistently and inaccurately used, and it's basically, maybe we can talk about quarantine for a second. As I understand it, quarantine is like a government mandated order. Isolation is an act one takes upon oneself, either out of one's own decision or with some level of encouragement, but not a legal order to do so. Is that how it's differentiated, or is there a different definition?
I have heard that as well. I mean, that's the one that I've, but yeah, so saying I'm self-quarantining isn't really accurate at all, because you could only really be quarantined by someone else. Like if they give an example here of the passengers on a cruise ship who have been quarantined.
When you're sent to a military base and they lock the door, that's a quarantine. And so I think it's important that we get that one right, because even in passive conversation, I hear this one being gotten wrong all the time. And it's not so much that I feel like we have to, in casual conversation, be in AP style, but that's a big difference. And it raises a level of alarm and fear that doesn't need to exist, at least as a result of a person isolating. So I think we need to be on the lookout for this, because I see this used incorrectly a lot in our copy.
I think that's a really good point. And I think above, if you scroll up again, I think there's something about shelter in place versus stay at home and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and it just says to basically follow what your government is saying, but not to, not to use those interchangeably. So.
There you go. Yeah.
It's different in every market what the rules are. So again, it's just us defining the rules and making sure that we have for our state or for our, you know, I mean, this goes down to obviously municipalities and stuff like that. Just making sure that we're defining all that correctly for our readers. So, okay, so that's the AP and Gannett style guide. Fun. First Draft News is, it has a really nice website dedicated to responsible reporting and ethics. So, so if you're interested in kind of the standards around this and what we should be doing, I think they have, it's really simple, and it's a nice little resource as well. And as you can see, avoiding sensationalist language, making sure that we avoid stock images that feed stereotypes. And that was something that came up, I think, on that webinar that I referenced yesterday of, you know, people just using a picture of Chinatown in their area instead, you know, oh my God, is that not terrible? So yeah, just be careful with, with those kinds of things to, you know, I think maybe we're past the worst of those things. I don't know, because so much now is on our area instead of on China. But
let's separately have a discussion about eliminating stock images in all contexts, because they're both inaccurate and out of context, and maybe even untruthful and misleading.
Yeah, definitely. Journalist Toolbox is updating a list of helpful links. It's a lot more about just reporting and getting, you know, having good resources and stuff like that. So, but there's just a ton of links there. So it might be worth checking out, you know, because we don't have enough things to do. But anyway, so yeah, there's just a ton of links there. I always find there. And then Night Science Journalism, MIT Tips and Tools has its own list. And it's a lot of different reporting tip sheets and some, just some articles that have been written by various news organizations. So anyway, lists of lists, right? And then Lenfest Institute also has a list of tips, tools, and funding. We're all interested in funding, different grants that are available and that you can apply for, and tips for journalists working from home, self-care advice, and that sort of thing too. So.
Yeah, and the funding one, you might have received the same message I got this morning from Yossi Lichterman talking about funding opportunities for this coverage, which I will raise to the top of the links that I send, because we could use the help.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely.
All right.
That's it. Just your questions. I think one of the things that Bill and I talked about before this was sort of safety, and I don't know who's on in terms of people who are actually having to go into the community, but I don't know how much people are able to work from home. I mean, obviously this affects photographers specifically. It's sometimes difficult to shoot empty streets over and over again. But I think that Andy Scott and someone else had a really nice, at the top of Network News, if everybody's getting Network News, had a nice list of kind of questions that you can ask yourselves and each other when you're thinking about assignments for people, just to make sure that people are safe. I think that's one of the other things that we talked about. Do you have any other thoughts about that, Bill?
No, I don't.
Okay, cool. But just one other thing that I thought, you know, we might want to think about in this, just making sure people are safe. One of the things I've heard Nicole Carroll say a number of times, she's the executive editor for USA Today, is we don't force people to do things that they're uncomfortable doing. So if somebody says, I have a concern about this, we try to find somebody else to do it, or we try to find a different way to tell the story. And I think those are important ethical conversations to be having too.
Great. Well, I think we've accomplished what we set out to do in the time we set out to do it. So I'm going to declare this to be an on-time arrival. And thanks for everybody for coming and for joining the chat and adding what you think and see and are wondering. And I'll share all these resources with you here at about an hour.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye, thank you.